Okay, folks.
Long live the king, you know it. King already, you know it. Top everything, you know it. King already, you know it. My body, soul, got a king body. Body gon' shine, bling, bling body. Calling all the shots, ring, ring body. Crown on your head, got a king body. Long live the king, you know it. King already, my baby, you know it. Top everything, you know it. King already, you know it. Shine already, it's time already. The line already, it's time already. Shine already, it's time already. The line already, it's time already.
Try to stop it, me say no, no, no. Royalty say don't you, no, no, no. Try to stop it, me say go, 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 go. Bubble up and watch it go, 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 go. Be ruler, yeah. Be ruler, yeah. Everybody are the conquer, yeah. Every king be stronger, yeah. King the rule them longer, yeah. Remember who you are, oh. Real king, oh. If I be brave, oh. And show your people my love. I'm ready, I say.
Sometimes when you feel like you don't have any control in your life, you have to get a hold of the very few dreams you do have and make sure you don't let them go.
I think the biggest challenge for me was the instability. It was really hard to stay grounded and to be able to kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel.
It was rough, very rough, especially moving schools, getting bullied a lot, like having parents that weren't yours pick you up, like a lot of judgmental kids or a lot of kids ask questions.
School was really different because you weren't really labeled. You're just like a student, like everyone's a student, and I can do the best I could in school. At home, no matter what I did, I felt like I wasn't good enough or whatever I did wasn't right.
There were a few kids at school who knew my situation, and for the people who were really supportive of me, that was okay because I had someone to confide in and someone who could show me empathy and really be there for me. But there were other people who knew my situation, and it felt like I was being bullied and that I was kind of being shamed for not having the same home life and things that a lot of kids at my school had.
I moved about like 4 different times for school between elementary and high. To me, moving schools was like kind of scary because it's like a new environment, new kids, and then you got to make friends all over again. And like growing up, friends, they really are important in school. Like that's like the main part of going to school in elementary school. So it was pretty scary.
I think in a
Okay, am I on? Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Friday, and welcome to CASA LA's Fireside Chat. I am Charity Chandler Cole, the CEO of CASA LA. At CASA LA, we organize the community to show up for children and families in LA County's overburdened child welfare and juvenile justice systems. Through an intentional, restorative, and culturally responsive lens, we train committed, consistent, and caring adults who take action by providing strength-based advocacy, equitable access to resources, and life-affirming connections. Our vision is a Los Angeles County in which all children and families impacted by the child welfare and juvenile justice systems have equitable access to the resources and support they need to thrive. Our mission and vision cannot be accomplished until our children live in a world that is equitable and just. That's why we are committed to doing our part to address racial injustice in the child welfare and juvenile justice systems, and ensuring and using this platform, our Fireside Chats, to bring communities and various stakeholders together to have real conversations about what's happening in the world of child welfare in LA County, with the hope of building awareness, informing our communities, activating a safe space for all, and strengthening our ability to advocate for our youth. Today, I have the privilege and honor of introducing you to a phenomenal group of people who are dedicated to transforming the lives of our youth and families in LA County and beyond. First up, we have Kawina Cole. We're not sisters, I know we have the same last name, who works for the National Center for Youth Law as the Senior Program Manager within the Compassionate Education Systems, also known as the Foster Ed Campaign, where they initiate and facilitate multiple state and regional collective impact campaigns, partnering with deeply invested teams of state and local leaders, students, and families to build real and measured progress toward a shared vision of improving the educational conditions and opportunities for the incredible group of young people involved in the child welfare system. We have Dorothy Daniels, who's the Executive Director of Fostering Unity, which provides caregivers and community service partners with a unique service delivery model offering real-time caregiver support, enhanced education, and resource navigation. We also have Craig Liu, who is an education attorney with the Children's Law Center and their in-house education team, which focuses on ensuring that youth in foster care have the tools necessary to overcome educational obstacles and succeed. And last but not least, we have our very own Dennis Rosenbaum, who is our CASA volunteer and who is committed to positively impacting the life of a child in foster care and advocating for their well-being, their rights, and their happiness. Thank you all for joining us today and taking time out of your busy schedules and on a holiday weekend, and welcome to our Fireside Chat. I truly appreciate each and every one of you. And for our audience, we will take a few questions towards the end if time permits. So please submit a question if you have one in the Q&A. So let's get into it. The number of children in Los Angeles County's child welfare system has consistently increased over the years, with a 20% uptick since the start of COVID-19. With these numbers comes the increased drastic outcomes for youth in foster care, such as homelessness, poverty, and incarceration. A contributing factor to these outcomes are their absence from higher education once aging out of the system, with less than 5% of foster youth obtaining a post-secondary degree, and subsequently their inability to compete and succeed in the career market and in life. Black and brown children are unquestionably at a disadvantage in every system and institution they interact with. And while they are resilient, they oftentimes lack the necessary support, services, and heart-centered action needed to not only level the playing field so they can have a fighting chance in life, but also give them the dignity and respect they are worthy of. While many Black and brown children are already deemed academically vulnerable based on their socioeconomic status, children in foster care are deemed to be even more academically vulnerable and disadvantaged. Education and pathways to higher education play a critical role in changing the trajectory of these children's lives. All facts that we know. However, what's often missing from this narrative are the real life experiences and barriers youth in foster care endure while attempting to normalize their educational experience. And COVID-19 has only exacerbated it, such as their emotional well-being, helping them navigate and process their trauma, acknowledgement of their real life current predicament, and so much uncertainty around their future and what it holds. So Craig, I'm gonna start with you, and the rest of our panelists, feel free to jump in. What are some of these real life experiences, challenges, and barriers that you've seen with the children in foster care that you interact with?
So thank you, Charity, for having me today at this Fireside Chat, and such an important topic and one that's near and dear to my heart. I think, and I know that we didn't get to see the entire video that you had just shown, but that video was really powerful, and hopefully we could provide a link, because the young ladies there that were talking about education, to me, talked about the three aspects of problems that we're seeing in real life right now, which is one, educational advocacy, and having someone behind you to support you. In the case of LA County, I really think that's having a strong education rights holder. And I could talk more about what CLC has in terms of a volunteer education rights programs. Second is stability. And stability right now is a huge issue that LA County is facing. Because this last year, everything was virtual, what we're finding now is a lot of children were placed and allowed to remain in the school of origins because distance wasn't in consideration. But now that we're coming back in person, what we're finding is how do we get our youth to their school of origins and continue with the stability when they live 40, 50, 60 miles away. So that's a consideration as well. And last thing is working with the school districts. And I think there has to be more of an emphasis on both sides, the school districts and from an advocate's point of view, and working with school districts to ensure that they understand, school districts understand what our foster youth are going through, and to be a little bit more compassionate in how we ensure that they have stability and educational advocacy, as well as just a normal educational experience, given what they've experienced with trauma and things like that. So to me, those are what we see on a real life basis right now, which is the educational advocacy, stability, and working collaboratively with school districts.
Thank you so much for that. Did anyone else want to chime in on that question? And I do want to throw in also, some of the experiences that I've personally seen and just, have known or researched about, in addition to, and I think school stability is such a big one. And I want to touch more on that when we do talk about the educational rights holder and how they're able to support that. But also, foster youth, our youth in foster care. They, experience school dropout and graduation rates. They drop out at a higher rate than most children, and they fail to graduate, at a higher rate than most children. Low academic performance, suspension, expulsion, and I could spend a whole fireside chat talking about the school to prison pipeline. So these are all things that our youth have experienced, do experience, and just with COVID-19 and virtual school, just seeing how, all of these barriers and experiences that our youth experience, for me as a parent, of 6 children and a relative caregiver, the one thing we didn't experience were the suspensions and the expulsions and even some of the consequences of the school to prison pipeline during COVID, which we, as parents, as a Black parent, were, excited about. And I was even afraid to send my children back, like, okay, what are we walking back into? But these are all things that, as we look at, okay, obstacles that were in their way at one point that were kind of removed, because of virtual, because of COVID-19, how does that look coming back? What fears and anxieties, do parents have around that and exist in that way? But I want to get to you, Dorothy, when even talking about that, because so what you do, as a caregiver yourself and supporting caregivers to help, the success of our youth, what are some of the challenges you've seen with the youth that you're helping around, their experiences with COVID-19, with virtual, with training, and most importantly, as caregivers, how we show up and help them and support them when we ourselves are, experiencing this pandemic at the same time.
Well, thank you, Charity. I think we need to go back to the beginning of COVID. And all of a sudden, almost instantaneously, caregivers who had schedules, who knew what they were doing, who would get the kiddos in the car, put them on the bus, they would leave. And really, the majority of their work was just staying in contact with these teachers who were doing the education. Now, within a very short timeline, they were told, your kids are coming home. You need a computer. You need access to internet and quality internet. You need to know what these kiddos are doing, and you have to support them. So a lot of our caregivers were unprepared and very nervous. I myself have 5 teenagers in my home, foster children. I don't know algebra. I don't want to know algebra. I got done with that. I don't want to do it again. And yet the support systems, especially in the very beginning, were very limited. We just weren't catching up fast enough for the caregivers that were home doing this hard work. So we worked a lot from the State Department and the county to bring education to the caregivers. This is how you find that quiet spot. This is what proper lighting looks like. This is what social interaction looks like now with our kids, because the depression was starting to get worse, right? Kiddos were finding, I haven't talked to my friends, I haven't seen my friends. And we all know that youth, that's such an important piece. And then the caregivers were getting frustrated. So what we're seeing now, and of course now as we approach going back, now that additional need to help caregivers understand how can they support the kiddos as they return, because now you have kids who are nervous. They haven't seen their friends. They may have gained weight. They cut their hair. They look different. Maybe puberty started during that time, right? A lot of issues now have come up as we think it's going to go back to normal. And what is normal? What does that look like right now?
Yeah, and that's so important what you said, Dorothy, because, I think we need to normalize the fact that as parents and caregivers, we don't have all the answers and even get all of it. And as a high functioning adult, and I'm saying that because I consider myself to be a high functioning adult and parent, and I was frustrated during COVID-19. I was trying to figure out how to do virtual school with 6 kids, with 6 different classes on 6 different devices, Lord, and work from home. God bless that I had the privilege of being able to work from home, because if I worked in an industry or field where I had to physically go to work every day, my children would have been forced to be left by themselves. But having to navigate the complexities of COVID-19 and education with teachers who, for the very first time, administrators for the very first time, are also trying to figure it out. We're all trying to figure it out together with pretty high expectations around and focus and emphasis on academic success during this time. As a high functioning adult, I almost gave up. I was like, what are we doing here? And how do I support the teachers? And does this make sense? And, Queen, I'm gonna jump to you as I kind of expand on that, because one of the larger things I saw during that time was the decline, the mental health decline of one of my children, my nephew, who I'm a relative caregiver for. Just first year of high school, excited to go to high school, at least he would have been had we been in a traditional setting. And during that time, we're sitting at home and the kids, they're doing virtual school. They don't like it. But one thing they have a lot more of was time. And for children in our foster care system, that means time to really look around, time to think about your circumstances, time to remember your trauma, analyze what you have, what you don't have, what you could have. The distractions that once existed, whether it was going to school every day and meeting with your friends, or, just being out in sports, whatever the case, my nephew started to have major anxiety and depression and anxiety attacks. And I would be like, what's wrong? What's wrong? And he wouldn't know. He said, my body's all of a sudden in pain, physical pain. And I keep thinking about all these things, and I want to be with my mom and I can't be, and she has this family, and all these things that were always an issue, but weren't as, heightened as before. They're now being forced to sit with these things, this trauma, and it's causing all kind of mental health issues and decline and anxiety and depression. And I, was personally trying to reach out, and figure out, who do I get help from, calling every hotline I can call, what mental health services do you have available for my child, and not finding any solutions, and having to just hug him and comfort him and ask him what he needs and be there. And it was just such a struggle. And I bring that up, and we can circle back and talk about some of the experiences of you guys of all experience when it comes to the mental health of your youth. But Kawina, I brought that up specifically because in that moment, we're trying to realize that our kids are having, all of these issues, and they're still expected to succeed. They're still expected to show up every day and go to school in a virtual setting. They're zoomed out, there's Zoom fatigue. There's the, why am I even doing this, especially with our teenagers? And, Kawina, you brought up AB 104, which covers, the interim retention process and focuses on grade changes and graduation requirements. And I know for us, my child was failing a lot of classes because we intentionally started to prioritize his mental health. And I had to reach out to his teachers and say, this is negatively contributing to what he's going through and experiencing. And how can we, how can we make up credits? How can we make this work? But I can't allow him to continue to show up every day failing when I know that it's hurting him. So what do we do? How do we show up? So Kawina, can you kind of talk about that bill, what it does, what it means, and what considerations are even taken in, when it comes to our children's mental health and why they're failing, why this need even exists?
Yeah, absolutely. So to kind of provide a little bit of context in terms of mental health, we totally saw that with the students that we were serving across several districts in LA County, where, like you said, they have the time on their hands, the trauma is coming up, or maybe because they're not able to interact with their peers or other adults and folks that would normally be able to gauge that their mood is changing and provide additional support. Those things were not necessarily in place, particularly for our younger students, where we were not able to communicate with them as much virtually, or they didn't have their own cell phones like our teenagers do in high school. So we definitely saw a mental health decline. And I did want to just share that, one of the ways that we were trying to mitigate those situations and put services in places focusing on school-based mental health, providing trainings to bio and resource parents around ways to access services to address the mental health needs of your students. And thankfully, a lot of mental health providers were providing telehealth, so students that had devices were able to do that. But along the lines of AB 104 and your question specifically, because we know that when students are struggling mentally, they struggle academically, because that's a basic need. It's kind of like food and water. If you're hungry, it's kind of hard to focus on math and science when that's the thing that's top of mind. And so what AB 104 does, there's 3 components. One is an interim retention process, which allows eligible students. So if they had any kind of deficient grade in the 2020-2021 school year, that policy would allow them to get a pass or a no pass. I do want to add the caveat that the applications for that exemption or change ended August 31st of 2021. So really short time frame. It was basically like school year started, come back. If you had deficient grades, you can do the application to get the pass, no pass. But the benefit of that is that it would not impact their GPA. And that's really what the idea was behind it, is so that fail doesn't negatively impact the student's GPA. They could do a pass, no pass instead. And I will also add that if a student decided to go that route, that there is no clarity around how post-secondary institutions would view that or weigh that in terms of their admission and et cetera. Another component of AB 104 is the local graduation requirement. So for those that aren't familiar, we have a state minimum graduation requirement that is 130 credits for high school students. And that is basically the core classes. I'm not going to go through each class that they have to take and how many credits, but it's 130 total. Most local graduation requirements are about 100 extra credits, and that's usually extra electives, visual performing arts, things like that. So this requirement allows students that were enrolled in their 3rd or 4th year of high school to graduate with the state minimum requirement if now they're not on track to graduate within that 4 years. And so again, it's kind of a safety net for the students so that they're able to stay on track toward graduation and not have to deal with, I guess, the negative ramifications of like all that was COVID and trying to learn and have an education during that time.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Kalina. Dennis, so the COVID-19 safety restrictions really had our CASA scrambling to find laptops, reliable internet service, on online learning tools for the children and youth they're supporting and advocating for. And as schools return to in-person learning, follow-up of learning loss due to the pandemic will continue to be a top priority for our volunteers, as well as parents and anyone interacting with our youth. And Dennis, in your experience, why is advocating for our youth right now so important? And what have you experienced working with your youth? And you're muted. Jovian, can you unmute Dennis?
Got it. Yes? You can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
So let me go back to the beginning, just before, or right when schools closed, the importance of advocating for them. With the onset of distance learning for kids, the comfort with technology that was required was daunting for a lot of kids.
Did we lose him, or that's that just on my end?
No, he's frozen.
Okay. All right, Dennis, you're frozen. If anyone else wants to take that question while we wait for Dennis, please feel free.
Well, I know that as soon as he said technology is daunting, I almost sunk in my chair, right? So when we were told by the schools that we needed to pick up and handle this education, and not only, as you said, do we have to find the technology, but then we have to know how to use it. How do we access Zoom? Each child in my home, as I said, same as you, 6 kids, each one different Zoom links at different times, some of them simultaneously, all of them pulling off of the same bandwidth. I found that to be one of the most challenging things. And the kiddos who I've always said are great at social media, they're great at social media, not necessarily school media, right? And so all of those things really promoted, a difficult time in the beginning, especially.
Yes, I agree. And thank you, Genevieve. I agree. This is a great demonstration of some of the challenges. Go ahead, Craig.
One thing I think this is great that we're talking about all these caregivers that actually care and have been working with their youth with education. But what we've seen is a lot of caretakers who really didn't care or put a priority on education. And when things started getting tough, just told the child, okay, don't worry about it, just don't go to school. So we have a number of issues with a lot of our youth who missed, a few months of school because the caretakers just didn't want to deal with it and maybe didn't know how to deal with it. So as a result, and because no one was reaching out to help them or provide direct advocacy, and because the schools were so overworked, with trying to get children online and figuring out the curriculum and different aspects of education, we have a large portion of our population that missed months of school at a time. So the question is, how do we get those kiddos caught up? For example, I know that in special education, there are different bills, and there are talks about providing compensatory education services for our special needs children. That in itself is an issue, right? Because compensatory education is education designed to put a student in the place they would have been had they received the special education services as indicated on their IEP. But because an IEP is defined as individualized, that means that we have to go forward and look at each child individual, see what their needs were, how comp ed is going to work out for them, what comp ed services are going to be provided. And that has been a very slow task for school districts to implement. So as a result, we have our especially our special needs population that is falling even further behind now because the compensatory educational services that they were supposed to be provided as per law is not being provided or not provided adequately. So now that's another barrier that we have to address on top of the year that they've lost because direct services weren't available in most schools.
And we did have to, as caregivers, wait for the school districts to kind of, change their way of education, right? You have teachers who are excellent teachers in the classroom, but had a real difficult time kind of transitioning to a virtual platform. Yeah. And especially our kiddos with special ed. We all know that sitting on a Zoom call is not as interactive, right? It's not as fun as what our kiddos were used to. So a lot of kids, honestly, resisted going on Zoom.
Yeah. And especially, Craig, you brought up our kids with IEPs and our kids that, need the support for special education. The same nephew I mentioned also has an IEP. And I would sit back and watch, how the teachers interacted with them. And I saw a teacher, and she actually sent an email. She sent evidence of this. I'm like, wow, why would you do that? So they had to complete 2 assignments during class time. And if you failed to complete both assignments, you are marked absent that day. And so I got an email stating this. And so I ended up reaching out to the principal saying, one, are the teachers unaware that he has an IEP, and in it says he needs more time to do his assignments? And two, you guys are deciding to risk not getting money for this child by having, if you're absent, you do not get paid for that child being there. So are you aware that your teachers, have this process in place where you're now losing dollars because children aren't able to complete assignments and they have IEPs during a specified time? What's going on? And so when I reached out to the principal, he addressed it immediately. But I'm finding that one, a lot of the teachers are either aware that students have IEPs because I was told there's an indicator on the attendance roll, or two, they're unaware, or three, completely just ignoring it because they're also trying to figure out what to do in this space. And then, how there's punitive, measures attached to that, like our children, and during this time when we're trying to navigate and understand the complexities of COVID-19, we're not looking at foster youth, how we're supposed to support them, and then they're being punished on top of that. So it's just, and Dennis, I see you're back, so feel free to chime in.
Well, a couple of things. I'll go back to what I was going to say, but and Craig can respond to this too. But what you said happened to your child, if I heard it correctly, is being an imposed absent. That amounts to what was one of the subjects you want to discuss, which is like an informal suspension, and that's not okay. But that's another topic. But the other thing, when I started indicating that the children are not participating, another factor is that the disruption in the continuity of instruction for these kids, with the resultant emotional upheaval, itself resonates with the trauma that all CASA kids are, almost by definition, whether it's neglect, abandonment, violence, upheaval, resonates with that. So it's another way to distance kids and maybe re-traumatize young people. Another thing is that the distance learning that did take place, I think, exposed inequities in resources available to children, not only of different backgrounds, but of different abilities. So having said that, now that the kids are returning, maybe having lost tremendous amount of education, I know schools and school districts are trying to come up with a generic compensatory time for all kids, and all kids deserve it. But as Craig said, this is something that can be taken up, because as far as compensatory instruction at an IEP meeting, it's not going to be solved at the IEP meeting. It may result in a dispute regarding the individual idiosyncrasies with that particular child, but it's a consideration. One of the vehicles for special needs kids, at least, when the kids return to, if not in-person instruction, but hybrid instruction, is that you can review the IEP. One of the first things is take a look at the IEP and see, well, has the child regressed? Is he going to need an inordinate amount of time just to get back where he or she was before the pandemic closed the schools? Is he or she need to take a look? Does the IEP team need to take a look at the child's goals? Are they still appropriate, the written goals, and sufficient for the child? Are supports and services that were in place beforehand, are they sufficient now? So does that mean that new assessments might be warranted? These are questions that are, and as I said, is compensatory instruction warranted, including not just for specialized instruction, but for related services, whether it's, again, speech and language, occupational therapy, physical therapy, audiology, a whole host of things. So these are things that I think are good things to think about for all of us, and that a lot of people, a lot of parents and kids and school officials I'm sure, are concerned about.
Absolutely, and thank you, Dennis.
Can I just say that Dennis brings up an amazing point with assessments. In my opinion, I think that because of this unprecedented time, and this is what we've been pushing with a lot of the IEPs that we attend as advocates, is to, even though a triennial assessment, so special needs children are supposed to be reassessed every 3 years. What we've been doing is to ask the reassessments to be pushed up because of this unprecedented time. Just like Dennis said, we want to see what the present levels of performance are. And especially in those cases where we may have a caretaker that wasn't taken educationally as strongly as they should have, and this child has missed multiple months at a time of school, that's the type of child that we want to be reassessed so that we can see whether or not the present levels are something that need to be addressed or if additional services need to be provided. And additionally, to figure out what, like Dennis was saying, the compensatory education needs to be.
Absolutely, thank you.
And to that point too,
please, yeah.
Because what we see a lot on the school side is we get pushback in that regard for students that may be new or don't already have an IEP in place, but an assessment is needed. And so I'm thinking about those students that have had these gaps in learning, and maybe they don't have an IEP, they haven't been in school for months. We hear it a lot, and I'm just curious, Dennis and Craig, if you also hear that because the student missed instruction time, they don't want to or cannot assess because they have to see that there is a deficiency in their ability to learn, not that it's a lack of access to the instruction.
You know, if I understood you correctly, and please correct me if I did not, if not attending school, truancy is a behavior. And if, I'm just giving an example here, and if a behavior is adversely affecting a child's access to curriculum or what's called FAPE, free and appropriate public education, then it's our, meaning the IEP team's obligation to take a look at what are the factors that are responsible or that contribute to that. And so you don't have to quote unquote wait to see failure. If that was a problem and it wasn't addressed, and the child or student is just not coming to school, and it's just let go, or just that's okay. From my perspective, that's not okay. Everybody saw that it was. I mean, that's not because I'm saying it. It's because it's stipulated in IDEA, Individuals with Disability Educational Act. If a behavior, and that is a behavior, it's adversely affecting the child's functioning and able to access, then that needs to be taken a look at.
Definitely. Thank you for that. Yeah, I was just curious if you've ever seen schools pushing back on the time frame that students are out of school and saying that because they haven't had access. We advocate exactly what you're saying, Dennis. I agree 100%. I was just curious if other folks have seen it in other areas.
We see that all the time. And we also see, and someone had, someone in the chat wrote down, do we see the educational system looking at foster youth differently? What we also see is the school district saying, well, because of the situation the child is in, being in foster care, that's why they're acting the way, or that's why they're not learning the way they should be. So just give them time to acclimate into our system, and then we'll see what happens, which is obviously something that is, well, not only illegal, but contrary to what IDA and what FAPE provides, especially if it's an initial assessment, which a school district cannot deny.
Well, we all know, right, that children are not going to be successful unless they're feeling safe and they're feeling good, right? They're not, no matter what classroom we provide, no matter what services we provide, mental health is such a key piece of this success of our kids. So I would really, and most of our kids who had been getting a normal mental health regime had to rely on virtual, which in most cases weren't as effective, right? They really weren't with their therapist. And so not only were they not receiving the education they needed, they weren't receiving the therapeutic therapies that they needed to heal from all of this trauma. So we took a child that was traumatized, right? Put him in seclusion with a caregiver who perhaps wasn't prepared and wasn't able to meet those needs. And now they're again lacking education, mental health services, and so on. So this is a broader problem, I think, then.
And not only were they not receiving those services, if the child happened to be in a trauma-informed classroom, and maybe that's a discussion for another chat, then he or she was missing out on that. And because he or she is essentially isolated, not only at the distance learning, but if he's going back to his residence, if that's where he's at, he's even more isolated. And so that's obviously definitely not trauma sensitive.
And to me, this is a good segue into, because I think the question really is, and I'm sorry, Charity, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
But I think the question is, what can we do for our youth now in order to address these issues? And to me, and the biggest platform I'm dealing with right now, and I can't stress this enough, is school stability. And that is one of the biggest challenges that we're facing right now. In the last 3 weeks, our team has attended almost 4 or 5 bids, which is best interest determination meetings per week. And we are constantly getting pushback, not only from the school, but by the department, as to how to keep a child in their school of origin. And that's the biggest issue to me that we're facing right now. And in addition to the compensatory education and getting the youth caught up, but can we get school stability back to ensure that all the youth that we're servicing have that right to remain in school of origin? And transportation is the biggest battle that we're fighting right now.
Absolutely. And speaking of, when we look at why school instability and placement changes contribute, and I just want to say, I think personally, school instability is kind of like the nexus we're seeing when it comes to academic performance, when it comes to imposing more trauma on our youth. Disruption of any kind, is traumatic for our youth. And then when they get in situations where they're finally able to make connections, make friends, create those emotional ties, and that's taken away, that just compounds, their experience, that compounds the trauma, and it adds to their inability to achieve. And it's just something that's often underlooked. And I want you, Craig, to even touch on that more with why, being an educational rights holder, one, what that means, why is it so important? And there's a whole foster youth education rights. And, one of them focuses on the right to remain in your school of origin. And you mentioned transportation, and that's something that's funded. Transportation is something that's funded through the county, through DCFS. And so, what does that mean in the context of children returning to school? How do we show up and support them? Why are educational rights holder so important? I know that was a lot. So
I'll just address the educational rights holder portion first. And so it's important. Being an educational rights holder is important to me for 2 main reasons. The first one, obviously, is special education. So we know that the only person that could sign off on an IEP to implement it is the educational rights holder. So you want someone there who's going to advocate for the child, who knows the child, who's going to make sure that the child receives a FAPE, a free and appropriate public education, as Dennis pointed out. And the second reason is for the school stability, because so as it stands right now, LA County and the OCP, the Office of Children Protection, did an amazing job with establishing a memorandum of understanding between school districts, OCP, as well as DCFS, to come up with a contract essentially indicating that transportation will be provided to our youth to the school of origin. Now, the only person that could sign off on that to see whether or not it is in the best interest for a child to remain in his or her school of origin is the educational rights holder. So that's why you want to make sure that you have someone who is going to fight tooth and nail for the child to remain in that school of origin, including pushing back on the department and the school to make sure that transportation funds are utilized. As Charity did point out, there's a bulk of money set aside by all the different agencies to ensure that transportation funds are provided or sufficient enough to provide the transportation our children need to the school of origin. But again, the only person that could sign off on that, saying that it is in the child's best interest to remain in the school of origin, is the education rights holder. So more than ever, it's important that, and this is something that we're really training our attorneys with, is to make sure that the education rights holder is identified, and to make sure that education rights holder knows how important their job is, not only if their child has special needs, but also for the fact of stability.
Craig, if I could just intercede here real quick. So here lies, I think, one of the issues that I see is education, right? It's letting caregivers know, those educational rights holders, if they are the holder of those rights, what is the protocol? We have caregivers calling almost on a daily basis saying, my high schooler, my junior high child wants to go to their school of origin. It's an hour and a half away. How do I access funding? And it's not something that's well known. So how do we educate social workers and supervisors and ARAs and CASAs and so on the process so that we can expedite getting these kids to their school of origin?
So every district has a foster youth liaison, and that foster youth liaison is supposed to be the one to help to start the bid process. So I'm hoping, I'm hoping that information gets trickled down to the education rights holder, because if school of origin is ever an issue, that's when the school is supposed to say, okay, let me get all the players here to make sure that at this bid, we have at least a social worker, the education rights holder, and the school of origin, usually the foster youth liaison, that's going to be at this meeting to determine what is in the child's best interest. It's and you're right, Dorothy. It's a process that not too many people know about. We still get emails and calls from our attorneys that are asking about the bid process. We recently had, I won't say what district it is, but we had recently had a counselor reach out to us asking what the bid process was. Bid is best interest determination. So it's something that we definitely have to get better at letting all the schools, the advocates, even the courts know about this process so that it's more effective going forward.
And Craig, who can be an educational rights holder? Like who can and who cannot? I think that's important.
As long as you don't have an inherent conflict of interest. So those are people like, for example, working at STRTPs, advocates that are paid for their services, like for example, attorneys. That's why minors counsel can't be the education rights holder. But usually the process of looking for who can be an education rights holder is we always start with the parents, because that to me is part of the reunification process. So the parents are the first people we look at. Now, if we have a situation, for example, where a parent may be like in a blackout program for a drug rehab situation, then we may want to look at someone else, like for example, a NEFRA or family member, or NEFRA, a non-related extended family member. If we can't find anyone at that level, then we want to see if we have anyone that is known to the child, maybe a team coach or a CASA volunteer. And then if we can't find anyone at that level, that's when we have volunteers through the Children's Law Center. We're also working with Referee Sobel on a new program called the BEST program, where we have volunteers that we train, do background checks with, that will hold education rights as well. So that's supposed to be the hierarchy, but as long as you don't have a inherent conflict of interest, social worker, for example, is another conflict of interest, then anyone could theoretically hold education rights for our youth.
I am an educational rights holder. Under IDEA, it does stipulate what the definition of a parent is, and one of the can't recall all the provisions, but if a court stipulates that a person is the educational rights holder, then that's considered equivalent to a parent. Back to keeping a child at his or her school of origin, I instituted that for a child during what's called extended school year. Extended school year is often referred to as summer school, but it is not summer school. Extended school year technically is approved at an IEP meeting when it's determined that a child's regression is such by the team that he or she an inordinate amount of time to get back to where he or she was. So I made the determination and discussed it with other persons that during distance learning, it made no difference where the child was, if I was satisfied with where he was beforehand. And so although there was some initial resistance, there was an agreement that he would stay at his school of origin at least during the summer session. Again, it's really not the same as summer school. It's called extended school year. And that's in fact what happened. And then that changed when the new school year began.
Thank you, Dennis. And I'm going to ask one more question in line with that, and then I really want to get to some of the questions in the Q&A. So in line with the importance of having an educational rights holder, before school started back, AB 130 was passed, which was an alternative to in-person instruction, which means there's two options for children to return to school. You either can physically return or you can do independent studies. And so public schools essentially were doing away with Zoom and virtual classes. However, and according to my understanding, that is not available for our youth with IEPs, and a lot of our youth in foster care have IEPs. So if you're a family or a caregiver who aren't sure about sending their kids back because of COVID and having them physically back in the classroom, or children can't attend because of COVID exposure or infection, how do we show up and support children that are essentially forced to go back to school, which in many cases may be in their best interest? For my nephew, he works better in in-person instruction environment, but having to be on top of the school to make sure if there is exposure, how do we continue, make sure he's still, able to stay on track? Or, what about the parents who don't want to send their kids back? Like, how are we able to show up and advocate for our youth who are going back to school that have IEPs?
I have two children in my home with both of them have IEPs. One's a 10th grader, one's an 8th grader. And I went to charter. So I avoided the whole public school system and went to a charter school that does have an IEP program, and it has a great actually IEP program for kids in special ed. So sometimes we have to look out of the box.
Thank you.
I could say this, that this is an unresolved issue. And I know of 3 due processes going forward with this exact issue. We're involved with one of them. One of them involved a mother. It was a child who was home a parent. It involved a mother who has a terminal illness. And if she catches COVID, it would severely impact her. Her doctor was so concerned that they actually wrote a note indicating that the children cannot go to school for fear that if they do contract COVID and they expose their mother, she could die from complications. So the question is what do you do? Because as you pointed out, Charity, there really is no fair alternative and appropriate alternative for our special needs youth. When we try to work with the district on this particular situation, they said the exact same thing, which was, look, the law lets us or allows us to do independent studies without the normal requirements that are usually required for independent studies, but we cannot provide any type of special SAI, specialized academic instruction, or any type of related services because that is, your child is technically not in the school as a special needs child, your independent study child. So that is the issue that is currently being resolved through litigation. We'll see what happens. Our position is if you provide any semblance of education to a child, that includes providing the child with a FAPE. So if you're going to have this alternative with AB 130, in my opinion, you also have to provide the FAPE aspect of it as well. But legislature didn't take that into account, and now we have to go through litigation and see what happens. The sad part is that by the time this all gets resolved through the court process system, because it's going to be appealed, God willing, the pandemic may be over, or at least circumstances may have changed completely in regards to in-person education. So we'll see.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to add that this brings up something for me in this conversation, and when we're talking about instability and transportation, because for me, it comes down to dollars. It's nice when we have legislation in place that will allow students to have rights, and in implementation, what we often see is the barrier is the finance to support certain bills. So when we're talking about transportation for instability, for example, I work with a district right now that's paying $500 a day to transport a student on Hop Skip Drive door to door, which is great, which they should. And we're like, yes, that's a win. She's a straight A student. She's in an IB program, got replaced out of the region, and that's what it cost, and we're going to do it. The reality is there's a certain budget for transportation. So if all the budget gets eaten up for a handful of students, the reality is we need more funding. And I think the same could be said when we're talking about individualized instruction within an IEP in a home setting. Could it be done? Absolutely. Just someone has to get paid for it. And I know that this is not like a quick resolution. And I think to Craig's point, by the time we figure all of this out, it may not even be a problem. But for me, it's like if we had adequately funded schools to provide the type of services, I think we could do an exceptional job making sure that students that have individualized education programs, students in care, all of them would have the services that they need. So that's my ask. Like we got to keep pushing our legislature to increase our budgets.
And Kawana, to your point, what you were saying before too, I think we also need to think outside the box as well. So we need to start looking at different alternatives to what we think of as an education system right now. For example, Da Vinci Rise has an amazing program that was specifically created for foster and homeless youth, where they have alternative curriculums. They have alternative times that you could start school. If you want to attend in person, come on in. If you want to do a virtual, that's fine with us. So we need to be flexible like that and have programs like that. And additionally, I agree with you 100%. The legislature really needs to take this up to make sure that transportation and school of origin is in the next few bills. And we really need to start recruiting for foster parents that live closer or in the Los Angeles area, so that we don't have to place our youth in Palmdale, Lancaster, wherever it may be, trying to figure out how do we transport a kid 60 miles to the school of origin.
Exactly, Greg. And that's one of the things that we're working on is purposeful placements. No longer looking for just an open bed, but looking for what is the perfect setting, or at least as close to perfect as we can get geographically, caregiver tools, right? Do they have the right tools for this kid's needs, right? Do they have the passion, the heart for a child that age? So we are looking very, very hard at trying to do better at placing children where they can be in the environment that will promote that healing that they need.
Yeah, just one last factor for that, transportation too is a related service. It's how a child accesses his or her education. If it's approved on the IEP and suddenly a child wants to go back to a school of origin, which is, maybe problematic for distance, maybe not, I guess for right now, that's just the financing of it's decided between the two districts. If you have, for example, a child with autism where a prohibitively long bus ride or something of that nature is going to be disadvantageous to the student, then that needs to be taken into consideration as maybe not in the best interest of the student. There's no easy solution, but again, transportation is a related service that's usually that is usually decided as a related service is whether it's deemed appropriate for a particular child.
Just one comment on that. And I've been in IEPs with Dennis, and he is an awesome advocate. But with transportation on an IEP, we just have to remember that there is case law out there that indicates that if the distance is too far on an IEP, the district does not have to provide transportation. And I want to make sure that we don't create too much bad law, whether that's why we have ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, which calls for DCFS to work with the school districts to transport the youth. Because I'd much rather rely on ESSA as opposed to IDEA because of the case law that we have in place currently for IDEA, which puts a limit on the amount of mileage before a district no longer has to transport as a FAPE accommodation. So ESSA is a lot more liberal in how we could utilize it, given that it doesn't have any type of limitations on distance.
Yeah. and I think we're at almost that time, and there's one question related to this from Ron Scott. Do any of you think that our educational system look or treat foster children differently? And I'll start that off with saying yes. And that's why we have so many advocates and educational rights holders and all of these people in place to advocate for their educational justice, because in my experience, they do look at foster children differently. And when they know they're in foster care, they know that they can treat them however they want, handle them however they want. But when they know that a CASA is going to show up for them, their attorney is going to show up for them, their educational rights holder is going to show up for them, they act differently. They treat our children with respect because they know someone's watching. When they feel as if this child isn't cared for, isn't loved, no one has their back, they're going to put them by the wayside. They're easily disposable, easily discardable. That's why they're suspended at a much higher rate. And so that's why these platforms exist. That's why we exist, to make sure that our children are treated with respect all the time. And I think the timing is perfect to end with a quote, because we end on time around here. And it's focusing on education as an act of love. And the quote says, "I've never encountered any children in any group who are not geniuses. Therefore, there is no mystery on how to teach them. The first thing you do is treat them like human beings. And the second thing you do is love them." And so I'll end with thanking my panelists for just so much information, a wealth of knowledge, your heart, your compassion, the work that drives you to serve our children is just, words can't even describe. So just thank you so much for showing up for our children each and every day. Thank you all, and have a great Labor Day weekend.
Remember who you are. Real king always we know. Give up be brave. And show your people my love. It's like my ready, I say it's like my ready. It's like my ready, I say it's like my ready. Only you got the remedy, I say you got the remedy. Shine your body, shine your body. Be your own king, make the body come rule your world. Yo, 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 yo. Be your own king, make the body come rule your world. Be your own king, make the body come rule your world. Yo, 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 yo. Be your own king, make the body come rule your world. Long live the king, you a king, you know it. Stop everything, you know it.